definitely continue to learn. I think be creative, be outside the box, be open, and be curious. Like at the end of the day, be curious.
I'm so glad you are here with me on the Vet Life Reimagined podcast. Today, I have Dr. Craig Mosley, who veterinary anesthesiologist isn't nearly enough to describe his fascinating career journey. He is a person who loves adventure and craves creating the new. As you'll find out, early in his career, he wasn't afraid to say, sure, to ideas that he hadn't thought about, and it gave him the confidence to create unique opportunities for himself later on. But I'll let him tell you all about it. Let's start with your beginning. When did you know you were interested in veterinary medicine?
What a question to ask. So here's the thing. I actually didn't know that I wanted to be a veterinarian probably until my later high school years. And even, through that time, I was also considering a lot of other options. I wasn't the kid who grew up, I did grow up in the country and whatnot, but I wasn't the kid who grew up with that in mind. I grew up in a very trades oriented family. And so, it was more like, well, you can be a construction worker or you can be a plumber or you can be an electrician. So it wasn't even on my radar, to be quite honest, until later. It's kind of funny because my mom's a nurse and I sort of said to her, I was thinking about being a doctor. And she's like, oh, you don't want to be a doctor. They're on call all the time. And, and she's like, and I was really into animals and nature and that sort of thing. And she's like, well, what about a vet? And so I became a vet, and guess what? I was on call all the time. So yeah, it was pretty interesting. So yeah, I didn't really come to it the way a lot of other veterinarians do, I think.
Yeah. So how did it win out in the end? Well, the end,
Yeah,
College.
yeah. Wow. How did it? You know what? I think veterinary medicine combined a lot of the things that I really enjoyed. I mean, I always have been a kid who loved nature and, loved animals and, thought, oh, I'm going to be a zookeeper one day and, kept all kinds of critters as a kid. But I was also really into science. Like I really enjoyed science and all aspects of science. And so it was just a nice meld of those two things. And interestingly enough, too, I found out I really like people. And it's disheartening to me sometimes. And I'm sure you've heard it too, where people say, well, I was thinking of becoming a human doctor, but I don't like people. And it's like, veterinary medicine is such a people business. Like it's all about the people. And so, yeah, so it actually worked out really well. And I actually got introduced to it because one of my friends in high school, his mom happened to be the vet in town where I grew up. And so I started working at her practice after school. And that's where I got my first taste of it. That's where I kind of figured out what it was to be a veterinarian and what it would be like. And yeah, it was awesome. It was a small animal practice. I wasn't exposed to large animal at that point, but yeah, that's kind of how it went out. I think it was just, I sort of fell into it, and I hate saying that, like I fell into it, but it wasn't a life plan. It was something that I, kept an open mind to and found out, yeah, I really do enjoy this. And I really like the people that I worked with. And I think that's a big thing. Like, the nurses that I worked with and the doctors, like just everybody was so kind and they were just nice people. And it was fun to go to work. And yeah, so that's how I got there.
Yeah, I like to think we're a good group of people. So,
Yeah, for
um,
sure.
how was the vet school process for you?
When I grew up in Ontario, which is up in Canada, and Guelph wasn't actually that far from where I was, and that's where the vet school was, and that's where the university is. And I happened to get a scholarship there, and I just fell into it. And so then I ended up there, which was probably a good thing. Because I think if I had ended up in Western Canada, I probably would have spent more time skiing and climbing and not enough time studying. Yeah, so I ended up at the University of Guelph. I did my 1 year of undergrad, and then I applied to vet school. I got in. I did my pre-vet year, and then hustled through vet school and graduated. And yeah, it was awesome.
So it sounds like the Canadian curriculum is a little bit different than the United States vet schools. Is that correct?
It is and it isn't. Historically, like, yeah, I went to school 25 years ago, so things have changed a little bit. And you could actually apply to vet school after your first year of undergrad. It was uncommon, and not a lot of kids did, and not a lot of students did. But you could apply after your first year, and then you had to do what they called a pre-vet year. So the minimum that you could do vet school in Canada at that time was 6 years. So, that sort of pre-vet year, and then, your 1 year of undergrad. Most of the people that went into vet school usually had a degree. So they had, either a 3 or a 4 year degree. And that would be what's more common now, I think. But at that time, we were able to sort of fast track it a little bit. And I don't know in the US whether you were able to at that time or not either. So yeah, I feel like I was lucky because when I was graduated, I was still quite young. And sometimes people are like, "You've been a vet for 25 years," and I'm like, "Yeah, I've been a vet for 25 years." So
Well, I mean, at least you still knew pretty early into your college years too, because not everybody even knows then what they're really interested in yet, at least these days. So
yeah,
that's good.
well, I did almost make a jump over into medical school in my second year of vet school. So I don't know if I really knew what I wanted to do some days, but
Is there a story there? I mean,
yeah, yes and no. I think I just, like I said, my mom was a nurse, and so I had a real exposure to what human medicine was about, just through her and her stories. When she come back, she was a OB-GYN nurse, so she worked with, with newborn babies, and it just seemed so rewarding what she did. And so I thought, well, I should, before I commit 100% to this vet medicine thing, why don't I go volunteer at a hospital? And so I actually volunteered at the local hospital, and that quickly convinced me that I never want to be a doctor. And it wasn't because of the hours or anything like that, but it was hard because it was the emergency room, and some of the things that you saw and the people that came in, it was just really emotionally tough. And we see things in animals sometimes that is emotionally difficult to deal with, but when it's an older senior who's fallen, and she was in her home for 2 days and nobody found her, and then she comes in, and it's just heartbreaking sometimes. And I just thought to myself, wow, I don't know if I can emotionally deal with separating my empathy for the situation from my profession. And we talk later maybe, but that I learned that later on as I was doing critical care too. I tend to have a lot of empathy for the people that I'm involved with, and that made it really hard. So that convinced me that I probably wouldn't have been a good, at least not an ER doctor.
yeah, it is its own world in itself. Um,
Yeah.
when did you realize you wanted to specialize?
That's another great, so when I finished vet school, I honestly didn't know what I was going to do. Like throughout vet school, I wanted to be a zoo vet because I had a real interest in, zoo, and, I had this sort of hobby of herpiculture, so reptiles and stuff. And I knew one of the faculty who was working also at the zoo, and she kind of told me, well, there's a lot of politics, you really sure you want to go into this? And I was like, oh. So at the end of vet school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do anymore, and so I went out into a mixed animal practice where I truly had that James Herriot experience. Like I've never read the books, but I literally did every species from pigs to cows to horses, dogs, cats, deer and elk and reptiles, and you name it, I did everything. And it was in that year, I guess, during vet school in my final year, I mean, I enjoyed a lot of things. Like I thought dermatology, and interesting enough, was quite interesting, and it was just because it was really specific and there was a lot of detail and nuance associated with it. I really liked ophthalmology, and then I really liked anesthesia too, but I didn't really think about specializing at that point. Like I was like, oh, I'm going to go out and be a vet, it's going to be great, it's so much fun. And I'm in this rural community, this tiny little place where there's one vet hospital and everybody knows the vet. And then the university actually contacted me because they didn't fill their anesthesia position. And they were like, so Craig, you kind of liked anesthesia, right? And I was like, yeah, I really like anesthesia. And they're like, would you have any interest in applying for the anesthesia residency? And I'm like, yeah, I guess so. And so I did, but I said my one stipulation is I wanted to do research on reptiles. I said, that's it, I'll come, but it's either got to be reptiles or elk. And they were like, well, we have no expertise in that area, but if that's what it takes, sure, we can explore that. And so yeah, that's how I ended up there. So I didn't even get that like the normal way that most people do.
That it never hurts to ask is
Yeah,
is the moral of that story. Well,
yeah,
interesting. So how what did you learn about reptiles and anesthesia? They're a hard one.
yeah,
I've done a lot of zoo, so
yeah. It was awesome. I mean, honestly, like I look back now and I think my residency was the pinnacle in some ways of my career. Not the pinnacle, but it was just I loved it because I was with a group of people. We were all working hard. Like, yes, you put in long hours and you didn't get paid well or anything like that. But, I'd spent all my career up to that point. I'd paid to learn. And here I was in a position where I was getting paid to learn. And it was amazing. And I loved it. And, as far as the reptile thing goes, I did some of the initial studies on looking at the inhalant requirements for reptiles. So there was no baseline. There was no previous studies. Everything had to be done from the ground up. So, it was awesome. Like I learned so much. I learned so much about research. I learned so much about, trial and error and oh, this didn't work. And, even trying to get an anesthetic machine and breathing system set up and the equipment to actually measure the inhaled and exhaled isoflurane concentration in these animals took a lot of MacGyvering and tricking around to sort of, get the systems to work because they were never designed for that.
mm,
And then reptiles in and of themselves, they don't have the same cardiovascular system that we have or the same respiratory system. And so it was just an awesome, awesome experience. Like I learned so much and it was such a creative time. Again, because there wasn't a sort of walkway for me. Like there was no sort of template that I could use. It was sort of, well, we've never done this. Where are you going to put a catheter in to get blood from a reptile? I don't know. Where are you going to put an arterial catheter in? Because I actually put arterial catheters in these animals as well. And so I had to do a cut down to the femoral artery and feed a tiny little catheter in. And yeah, it was crazy. So much fun.
yeah.
So yeah, I learned a lot. I really learned a lot. And then subsequent to that, I'd stayed at the university for a couple of years as a staff veterinarian, and then I worked with another grad student who did more research in reptiles. And so, my career, I've got a lot of research in reptile stuff. And even just recently, I just finished another project with a resident at the Toronto Zoo, looking at more reptile anesthesia stuff. So it was good. It was a great decision, I would say.
Yeah. So what did you decide to do after the residency? Like how
Uh,
did you know? Did someone ask you to do the next role or what was the path after that?
Yeah, so here's the thing, Megan, you asked to interview me and talk. My career has been like this kind of a trajectory the entire way. I actually, I love my residency. I was very interested in all areas. Like I wasn't one of these people who was, laser focused, anesthesia, anesthesia, anesthesia. I actually spent a lot of time in the ICU and I love the ICU stuff. And I kind of always thought, anesthesia, I'm basically monitoring a patient over hours, but it's the cardiopulmonary system, that you're really sort of focusing on. And in an ICU patient, it's the same kind of thing, but you're doing it over days. And so actually, when I finished my residency, I actually thought about getting double boarded in anesthesia and critical care. And so I didn't actually know what I wanted to do at that point. Like I literally was thinking, what, this anesthesia thing, it's great, but I'm tired of leaving my patients at the ICU door. I'd like to follow them longer into that post phase and recovery and still have management of them. And so I actually went out and took up a job in Santa Cruz, California, where I actually did emergency medicine and oversaw an ICU for a number of years. So I finished my anesthesia residency, immediately go out and do emergency and critical care medicine.
Something completely different. Yeah. Well, I'm
uh,
sure they loved having an anesthesiologist though in critical care.
yeah, it was different, and it was a private practice, so it wasn't an academic environment, and so there really was an anesthesiologist in private practice at that time. And so that's where I kind of had to pivot a little bit. And I'd done emergency medicine, and as of that, my first year out, I mean, I did all my own emergency, and so I was pretty comfortable with emergency medicine at that time. And so that's where I made that little bit of a pivot to be like, well, I can do critical care and emergency medicine. And yes, I'm not boarded in it, but I can learn. And that's where I learned actually that again, that empathy part, I just got too connected to the clients and the owners of the patients. And I found it really, really, really emotionally hard to do that. And the critical care people, I mean, kudos to the people who do critical care. That's a tough job. I mean, you're dealing with these clients who come in. Sometimes the animals, you can't tell them they're going to live or die. Sometimes, the prognosis might be 50-50, or it might be less than 50%, but the owners are willing to give it a go. And so you may have that patient and that owner in that situation for 5-6 days, and you can't help but form a bond with that owner over that time period, or I couldn't. And I found that I was running myself sort of into that phase of, I was giving, and I couldn't figure out how to get recharged, because I couldn't let go of my patients. Like, even at the end of my 4 days on, I would still want to connect with those patients, and I would, I'd connect with the owners all the time, and I didn't have a good way of kind of separating myself from that. So I actually decided at that point that probably critical care, as much as I loved it, it probably wasn't going to be a long-term gig for me. And I actually went back to the University of Guelph at that time and took on a staff position. And that's where I did more reptile anesthesia. And I finished like my boards and whatnot, because I hadn't done my boards when I'd done this stint in Santa Cruz. And so then I went back to the university and did more anesthesia, and then kind of committed to the anesthesia route, and then really enjoyed that.
Yeah. While you were doing critical care, did you have a lot of mentors or people that you spoke to just in general about, career life, those kinds of things, just as a support system?
You know what? I wish I did.
Mm.
At that time, I don't think, again, it was so long ago. I don't think we really talked about those sorts of things. Like, like today, people will talk about burnout and, compassion fatigue. We really didn't talk a lot about it back then. And so I didn't really have anybody to talk to about that. And, my partner at the time, she was an internist. And so, I could talk to her about it, and she understood because she was dealing with the same thing, but it didn't go beyond that. And so, my mentor, in terms of critical care was, Carol Matthews, who's a criticalist up here in Canada, quite well known. And so I use her as a resource to help me with cases and the medical aspects, but I never really talked to her about that. How do you manage that, and how do you separate yourself from, or how do you put I don't even want to say put a wall, because you don't want to put a wall up, but
Boundaries.
how do you boundaries? There you go. How do you set those boundaries? And so, yeah, unfortunately, I didn't talk to anybody about it. And maybe had I talked to somebody about it, maybe I would have learned some coping skills, and maybe I would have still been doing critical care. Maybe I would have gone back and done the residency and gotten double boarded, but no, I
Yeah.
didn't.
I think it's also good just to be self-aware as well. If that's not where you're going to thrive, even if you do have some people that help you how to manage some things, I think there is a part of you deep down that knows this isn't for me long term. So I think that it's still good that you were able to recognize that and go
Yeah.
back to something that you really enjoyed with I can tell you're a big learner, and you like some creativity in your career as well. You've done a lot of different things. So so you went back to Guelph, and then what was the kind of the next steps of you trying to figure out exactly what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Yeah, so I went back to Guelph, and I was in a staff position, which wasn't a faculty position. So you're basically doing a lot of clinical work. But I really like being in the academic environment. I love teaching. Like, I really love teaching, and I love the sort of light bulb moment when a student is like, "Oh, I finally get it." And also anesthesia. Like, I'm a very laid back anesthesiologist, and I think, I liked it that the students felt relaxed when they were with me, and they didn't feel like, because they're all so stressed when it comes to the anesthesia, because they all think that it's this close to death all the time. And I'm like, actually, it's more like this close to death. Like, it's a long way. Like, you have to do a lot of wrong things in order to kill an animal most times. So I really love that. And so I was actually looking for a faculty position, just kind of scoping out what was available. I knew there was probably one that was going to come open at the University of Guelph. But, I'd done all my training there. And the only time I'd gotten out was when I went to Santa Cruz. And I loved Santa Cruz. I mean, I love the West Coast. And an opportunity came up at Oregon State University, which at the time was quite small, and it still is a quite small school, but they didn't have a small animal program at that time. So the students actually went to Washington State University for all their small animal curriculum, and they had no small animal clinic, but they were building one. And so they were looking for an anesthesiologist. And, I can remember in my mind, I had these two choices. I could stay and wait for an opportunity at this big, prestigious institution where I could just fit in. I could slip in, my career would be made in the shade and away I'd go. Or I could go to this little university that was just opening up a small animal clinic on the other side of the country in another country, like again, because I was in Canada, which one do I do? Oh, it's a no-brainer. Of course, I'm going to go to that other opportunity.
You get to be
And
creative
Oregon,
again.
yeah, and it was such a great experience. Like, had I stayed at the University of Guelph, I probably would have taught, maybe one or two lectures. And instead, because I went to Oregon State, I actually was the coordinator for the course and was able to teach, a good majority of the lectures and to create new programs and to create new curriculum and, just starting from the ground up and then also contributing to the small animal clinic. And it was awesome. It was probably again, the most productive 4 years of my life for sure. It was amazing.
Yeah. What were some of the lessons that you learned from being that close with the students? Any
Uh,
advice you give people in vet school?
yeah, you know what? I think because Oregon State was quite small, the students had a lot of access to the faculty. And I think sort of breaking down that hierarchy was kind of a good thing. Like I was very accessible, as were all the faculty. And, we were very, I don't know, very open with the students. And it was a smaller class. And so you got a lot more, time with them. So I think I just learned to be a better teacher for sure and how to connect with the students. And also Oregon State had a really good education program. And so I was able to learn there. Um, I think, you know, so a whole bunch of things I learned there. And I made some mistakes. I'm not going to lie. I mean, life's full of mistakes, but um, I think what I really learned there was to slow down and have some patience. And I'm still working on that piece. I'm not very patient. And I don't mean like I can be extremely patient with a student who's trying to learn, and I understand that. But if there's something that needs to change, or there's a program that we need to start with, or I need it to happen. Like I can't wait for 3, 4 years for something to change. I'm like, well, we know it needs to change. So let's just change it and let's do this like today. And so patience was probably the thing I didn't have. And I was really pushing to have a resident at the time, and there was no resident. And I started out, I got a fellow in anesthesia, and I had a second fellow in anesthesia, and I was really pushing for a residency, and I couldn't get one. And I think I got frustrated and kind of said, I'm never going to get a resident here. I'm out, and also, academia. I mean, I love academia, but it's a big system, and it doesn't, it's this big institution that, things change slowly in academia. And so I think I got a little frustrated, and I regret some of that. And I regret my inability to be patient and to wait. And, I worked with a wonderful anesthesiologist. He was probably 15 years my senior, and he was a person who had the patience of Job. Like he was amazing. And I wish that more of him had rubbed off on me, because here's a person who had started his career at Oregon State. He'd slowly built up the anesthesia service. He was one of the people who had pushed for this small animal program and even pushed for the school and everything. And, he'd put his entire career there. And I think, man, like he saw a change, but it took a long time, and I wish I had more of his patience. And I did learn a tremendous amount from him. And so, if I think about people who really influenced me and really made me a better person and a better anesthesiologist, hands down, it was Tom Regold, 100%. Like he was an unbelievable person and an amazing anesthesiologist. Different style than mine, but very, very good at what he did.
We definitely need those people in the world who are that patient, who will just stick to something and make sure it does happen eventually. So
Mhm.
I think that is good to find the people who are very different from us, to learn. It doesn't mean we'll necessarily completely become that patient or that person, but yeah, that learning opportunities sound like they were really wonderful there.
Yeah, it really was. And, again, I never regret any of the decisions that I've made. I always feel like that there was always something I'd learned. And I've also learned about myself. And it's also, you kind of alluded to it. You have to be self-aware and be like, okay, this isn't working necessarily. And I was always the kind of person who, if I'm not happy in my work, then I'm probably not doing it very well. So
Mm.
it's probably time to make a change, because then you just become one of those toxic negative people. And I never wanted to be one of those toxic negative people. And so, I think I was quick to be, hey, if this isn't working, it's not working, and it's time to look elsewhere. But so yeah, it was probably a good move actually to leave Oregon at the time. But I did learn a lot there, and I still think about Oregon State all the time. It's still one of my favorite schools. I think they have one of the best undergraduate curriculums out there. The students get so much hands-on, and they come out so confident, compared to what you see at some of the larger universities where students get far less hands-on. So
Yeah. So what called you after the Oregon?
so then I still wanted to stay on the West Coast, and so then I ended up in a private referral practice as the first anesthesiologist at this large private referral practice in Vancouver, Canada, which again was another amazing experience. And I recognize that I'm attracted to doing something new and going someplace where it doesn't already exist. So there was no anesthesiologist. They hadn't even really thought of an anesthesiologist. And I sort of just happenstance put my name out to them, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we might look at that. That'd be interesting. Yeah, let's come up for an interview." And the next thing you know, they offered me a job, and I ended up there. and Yeah, and that was great. And that role again, it turned into more, because I then became the medical director at the hospital as well, which gave me a taste of a different side of vet medicine. So, being a clinician is one thing, but and I think, all of us as clinicians are clinician leaders. Like whether you want to be or not,
Mhm.
you are when you're on the floor. Like you're working with a team, and if you're the person who's in charge of that team, you are a leader on the floor. And so, emergency medicine is a perfect example of that, where you're the doctor on, you've got to coordinate everybody on that team, and you're also responsible for that team. And when things are going sideways, you need to figure out how to bring that team back into play. And I think as an anesthesiologist, my job is to serve my colleagues. Like my job is really, my client is really the other services. And so I think for me to transition into a role as medical director, it was a very natural transition, because I was already working with all these people. Like I already knew how surgery worked, and how internal medicine worked, and cardiology worked, and neurology worked, and and critical care, because I touched all of those areas of the hospital all the time. Whereas if I had have been, say, just a surgeon, might not have had that much interaction with cardiology, might not that much interaction with neurology, other than maybe to share cases once in a while, or compete for an OR or whatever it might be. Um, so that was another great, awesome experience. I learned so much, and yeah, it was great.
So I would imagine that a medical director might be an attractive role for a lot of clinicians. So with your experience in leadership, what are your thoughts around first of all, kind of like you alluded to, you leave vet school and you become a veterinarian and you're a leader automatically. So what are your thoughts around just leadership in this type of setting? And then also, being a really big leader like a medical director.
Yeah, I think, one, I wish that, and I know we're getting more of this in veterinary school now, but I wish we'd had more sort of training on how to be a good leader and what a good leader is, and just sort of understanding. I don't want to say the science behind it, but there is, like, like I've taken subsequently, I've taken a lot of leadership courses, and I'd started a graduate degree in business, and so you kind of learn some of these things through that, and obviously through reading. But there's just not a lot in vet school that we're taught, and I think I wish that we were, because again, it's a tough job to do when you don't have some of the innate skills. Like sure, you might have natural ability as a leader or whatever it is, but there's all these other things that you didn't know that come along with being a leader. Like some of the negative stuff that comes along with being a leader. Like, you have to make tough decisions sometimes, and those tough decisions, you take pretty personally. Like, I think some people think, as a leader, if you have to let somebody go, or there has to be something that happens or something that is perceived negatively, they think it doesn't bother you. Like, it's, they're cold and callous, but it does bother you. It bothers you immensely. And yet you don't really have the skill set necessarily to deal with it or how to manage that part. And um, so yeah, I think it's an important thing we should all learn, and it depends on the level of leadership that you are. I think, if you're a leader in the hospital, that's one thing, but you become a leader of a big hospital or a big group, which, I subsequently came to do with VCA Canada. There's a whole different, thing that goes on. And yeah, it was tough. There was, and listen, I'll be honest, I burned out at that job. I did. I basically, I think I was burning the candle at too many ends. I mean, I was having my second child. I had two kids under, 3 years old. My wife was, trying to do everything at home. I was doing a graduate degree in business administration. I was the medical director. I was still working full time as an anesthesiologist at the hospital.
Oh, wow.
And it was just everything. Like, I can remember every weekend spending, from 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock at night studying, or working on an assignment that I had to submit, and, some accounting thing, or dealing with something with the hospital. And so, but again, I didn't know any better, and I think as a veterinarian, like, of my generation, and I'll say my generation, because again, I think now veterinarians know how to put up those boundaries. I didn't know. I thought you just took it all. And if you said, I can't do it, like if you said, I can't, or if you said no, that was like, well, you're weak, or you're not very good. And so I just would say, yes, I can do it. No problem. Yes, no worries. Whereas now, I think if I had done that same job at that hospital, I would have said, you know what, I can only work 2 days a week clinically, and then I need 2 days to do that, or 3 days, or whatever, or maybe just more clearly define what my role was at the hospital. And then I probably wouldn't have bit off so much at the same time either. I probably wouldn't have tried to, do a graduate degree at the same time, and start a family and all those sorts of things. So yeah, I did. I burnt out at that point, and I had to step away. And my wife, who also happens to be a veterinary anesthesiologist, she actually went back to work, and so she, we were looking at opportunities, around, and there was an opportunity that came back up at the University of Guelph where I had previously been, and she applied for it and she got the job. And so we moved back to Ontario again. So we've been bouncing around a little bit, and that was a good break for me. I basically became the stay-at-home dad for 2 years, and that's what I did.
Yeah.
So that was my next career move.
And that has its own adventures all in itself, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Where did you meet your wife?
Yeah, so my wife actually was hired on as the third anesthesiologist at Oregon State University.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's where I met her. So yeah, so she came, and I don't know, we worked together. We got to know each other. We're the same age, same vintage, and yeah, the rest is history. It's kind of a weird, because it's like, it's one thing for veterinarians to marry vets, or to, marry technicians, but for a veterinarian to marry another specialist in exactly the same role, a little weird.
Yes. Very
But
unusual, but no, that's really neat. Just going back to show the good people Oregon attracts.
yeah,
Um,
totally. But that was also, I think, another lesson I learned, is because my wife and I worked together and we were in the same department, the same job. Again, how do you separate work from home? Like, we'd go home and we'd continue to talk about work, and that was toxic. And
yeah.
again, my 50-year-old self now, if I wish I could go back and tell my 35-year-old self, you know what, you need to set limits. Like, when you're out of work, you don't work, but we did. And, I think too, at that time, I would write my lectures on the weekend, evenings, and it just seemed like there was this continuum, like work never really stopped. And so that probably wasn't a good, healthy thing either for us. And subsequently, since then, we've tried not to work in the same places. But it's hard as an anesthesiologist, because there's not like 5 clinics looking for an anesthesiologist. It's
Right.
one hospital. you know?
Yeah. Oh, it's so funny that you brought that up because I just had that conversation yesterday about vets marrying vets and having to know boundaries about, when it's home time, you don't have to be a vet, your spouse first.
Yeah.
um, so how did you end up with VCA?
Yeah. So, well, when my wife and I, when we came back, as I said, I took 2 years off to be a stay-at-home dad, and that was a really interesting time too, just because during that time, I purposely never ever told anybody that I was a veterinarian. I basically said, like, when people ask me what I did, I said I was a stay-at-home dad. And I did that purposefully because part of, what I was trying to figure out is so much of my identity was tied to being a veterinarian. I'd been a veterinarian at that point
Mm.
for, I don't know, probably that was maybe 15 years I'd been a vet. And everything was vet medicine, vet medicine, vet medicine. And, everybody knew me as a veterinarian. And so I purposefully did that just to see if people still valued me or still, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's just
Yeah.
this dynamic, and it was really good because I realized that, we are more than just our profession, and people do like people for other things besides you being a veterinarian. So it was another one of those opportunities that, I feel like we learn so much through the school of hard knocks. We should know this. It's just
Mhm.
like separate your work from your the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be a continuum. But that really did impress to me that, you know, I am more than just my profession, and which was a really good wake up call. And also having two young girls at the time, like, that was a big wake up call, and really made me refocus my objectives and my priorities. So you asked how I became part of VCA Canada. I started to go back to work, just part time. I was working at a small referral hospital in the Toronto area, and they only needed me 2 days a week, which was fine. So I just would go in 2 days a week. And then the owners sold the hospital, the VCA. And at the time the company was called Associated Vet Clinics. They were sort of owned by VCA in the background, but they weren't really managed by, or really there was no branding or anything like that. And the president of the company basically ran it the way he wanted to run it. Anyway, they bought it, and I thought, "Ooh, this is gonna be weird. I'm gonna be out of a job," because they didn't have any anesthesiologists within VCA or within this company, AVC, that I was aware of, and I'm like, "They're gonna look at me and be like, 'How do we deal with what do we do with this guy?' Like, yeah, he doesn't produce directly, and they're just gonna cut him." And so, so I was a little bit like, "Uh-oh, what's gonna happen?" And so I actually, when they did come to tell us that they had bought the clinic, and, like, the president of the company came, and some of the directors, I sort of said to him, I said, I introduced myself and I said, "Hey, I'm Craig Mosley, whatever." And I said, "I'm an anesthesiologist." And he's like, "Oh, I don't know anything about anesthesiologists." And, I happened to be going out to Calgary, which was where the head office was. And so he invited me to breakfast, and I met him and talked to him, and he was very open, and he was like, "This sounds really great. Like, I'm super excited to have an anesthesiologist as part of our company." And so it was awesome. Like, so that was really, really good. And it gave me a really positive feel about this company who had just come in and bought this hospital. And so yeah, then I was just a doctor with VCA at that point. So I was working as a clinician.
I think a lot of times as veterinarians, we do get very attached. We do put our identity to what our title is and what we do as a career. And we are so much more than veterinarians. And I think one reason why I like to emphasize that point is because another passion of mine is the future of the profession. And I am very excited for technology to come. I am so excited for all these wonderful things that I think we're going to have as resources to make us better at patient care and all these wonderful things. But I also see a lot of people that makes them very nervous. And I fear that one part of that is because they think it's going to start to take away their identity, what they think they're supposed to do and be. And I think that's not it at all. I think there's much more of a human factor, which is very much holistic. It's more than a physician or, fill in the blank with whatever title you have. It is about Craig the dad, Craig the empathetic, human being who can connect with another human being. We started to talk about this a little bit in our other conversation. Any other thoughts around the future of the profession? You've gotten to see it from so many different angles, and working with big organization like at VCA. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and so where do I start on that topic? So
It's a
just so
big.
you know too, like also within VCA, I did move on to another role. I became sort of the national medical director. So I moved into
Yeah.
this other role afterwards. So yes, I did get to see a lot of the insides of the organization at VCA, and I was there when Mars came along and the whole 9 yards. I'm like you, I'm super excited. I am super excited about where we can go as a profession. I have no illusions that we will ever get rid of veterinarians, but I think we can do our jobs better, more efficiently, and you know, give greater access to our expertise basically by leveraging technology. I mean, I think that like there's the book, The Future of the Professions, that is a book that I recommend it to everybody, anybody who's in any kind of profession. I don't care whether you're a doctor or a veterinarian or a lawyer or what. I think everybody should read that book. But in that book, a lot of what they talk about is sort of the practical expertise and making that more readily available. And by holding it tight in this little area, the costs of that information are really expensive, right? Like, so, no one goes to an accountant anymore for basic accounting. Like they use TurboTax or whatever it is. Now, if you have more complex accounting needs, then sure, you need an accountant. But that basic practical expertise is made available, which makes accounting and making our ability to do our taxes so much more accessible because it's much cheaper. And I think the same thing can be said for a lot of things in veterinary medicine. And I don't want to cheapen down veterinary medicine, but I also recognize there's a large percentage of pet owning population who will never walk through our doors.
Mm.
Never, ever will they walk through our specialty hospitals. And as a profession, I feel so strongly that it's our onus and it's our responsibility to make sure those people also receive care. And we can't keep hiding under this, gold standard, which we shouldn't even use that term because it puts value associated with what we're providing. And it should be more spectrum of care because there's value associated with every level of care that we can provide. It's not that one is better than the other. It's they're different. I always use the analogy, we can use a car to get us to work. Well, I can use a Honda Civic to get myself to work, or I can use a Mercedes to get to work. Both will get me to work, but one is going to get me to work in a lot more comfort and a lot more style than the other. It doesn't necessarily mean one's better than the other. If I only want to pay for a Civic, then that's the perfect car and it's the gold standard car for me, and so, but yet some people will use this veterinary medicine that we've got to work to this gold standard and all these things and all this testing. And I don't disagree. Like you need to do great medicine, but I also think we can do a lot of really great medicine that's more sort of that practical everyday stuff and make it accessible to everybody who owns an animal. Like that's my dream. And I think that's where technology will help us, is technology will allow us to actually bring down the costs, make really good quality information and care to an animal or a pet owner more accessible. Like people always used to complain about Dr. Google, right? And when I was starting as a vet, vets would lose their minds. Oh, these clients went to Dr. Google and blah, blah. And I'm like, you know what? Actually, I don't mind if my clients actually go to the internet. And in fact, I encourage them to go. Like when I was doing emergency medicine, that was the earlier days of the internet, but I was in Silicon Valley. Like Santa Cruz is kind of south of Silicon Valley. So there's a lot of techie people. And honestly, I wanted them to go to Google, but I wanted them to go to a good resource. Like I didn't want them to go to, doggydoctor.com that's run by some random breeder or something. I want them to go to a really good website that was put out. Like, it's like us going to WebMD, right? It's like, if you're looking for information about a medical condition, you're going to go to a reputable site. And so I think there's a lot of power in giving more power to the pet owner because they'll come in, they're more informed, they already know a lot of the nuances. And so for me, my job now is to help them interpret that information. It's not to provide them information, it's to help them interpret it. And that's what I always taught when I taught students too. I always felt like my job isn't to feed you the information and stand up here and just recite stuff, not to tell you about basic physiology. You can read that in a book. My job is to help you put that into the greater context. And I think with veterinary medicine, there's so much information now that an owner, like if an owner wants to become an expert on feline diabetes, they can do it. There is enough information on the internet to become an expert in that. But they might not know the clinical sort of nuances that we would know as a clinician. And that's where we can help them. It's the same when you're teaching a student. I mean, as a veterinarian, I've been in the clinics, I've done this, I had that actual clinical experience that I could use and help the students then use that information, put it into the wider clinical context. And I wish we understood that that's our role as a veterinarian. It's not to hold this information sacred and no, nobody should ever have access to it unless they come through me. No, I'm like, throw it wide open. Let everybody have access to it. Let them be educated, let them learn, and I'll help guide them. I'll help them figure out where that information fits into their situation, taking into consideration, what they're looking for, like the value that they perceive. And this is a whole other tangent we could go off
Yeah.
on, but there's sort of that value component, right? Like for you and I, the value that I might associate with having a Civic versus a Mercedes, they could be very different. They could be very different a criteria that you and I may have. Like you may value the Mercedes a lot more than I would ever value the Mercedes. For me, that's a low value item. For me, the higher value item is actually the Civic, because it allows me to do more with the other income that I have. I don't have to spend all this money on a car. Same thing with pet care. I mean, there's nothing wrong with an owner saying, you know what? I can't treat the cruciate in my dog right now with a TPLO or some fancy procedure that's going to cost $4,000. But I can treat my dog with this other option. Maybe it's a extra cap, and yeah, it's an old technique, and people can, or maybe it's bracing and analgesics and allow. There's other, but what value does that owner get? Like they may get more value by that less expensive option, not because they can't afford it, but because they want to put their resources elsewhere. And I think, again, I think we haven't figured out how to articulate that in vet medicine, and I can't articulate it very well either, obviously, but I think that's where technology can really start help us and help us as clinicians too, to download or offload a lot of that sort of routine stuff so that we can do the stuff that only we can do as humans, which is, in my opinion, that connection piece. Like I can connect with an owner and I can help them through some difficult decision making. A machine is never going to do that. The internet is never really going to do that. You know what I mean? And, we had this experiment of virtual care that happened during the pandemic. And, that was something that I've been pushing really hard within, VCA and, trying to get our, like prior to the pandemic, actually, this was something I was like, we should offer this. And, vets were like, oh, this is going to be terrible. Like people aren't going to, it's going to degrade the quality of medicine. And I'm like, it's just a different tool and a different way to provide information to owners about pet care. It's never going to replace the physical exam. It's never going to replace an in-hospital visit, but it's another way to make it more accessible. So I guess I just think we've got to stop being so afraid of change and recognize that change is actually good. And, change will happen and there's going to be positive, and you can't protect everything. Like, we can't put regulation around everything and regulate our way into this little carefully constructed box. We want to protect the public from unscrupulous individuals out there doing crazy things and claiming vet medicine. But at the same time, I don't think that we can also neglect the fact that people will get access to that stuff anyway, regardless. So let's be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Anyway, I kind of go off on a tangent here. Sorry, you asked.
No, no, we're both really excited about that topic. So maybe we could have another conversation. But as we're about out of time here, and it may even kind of go along with what you're talking about. Do you kind of have a big overall recommendation for people or for veterinarians, veterinary technicians in their career? What would kind of be some advice based off your experience that you feel like the profession could hear?
Yeah, I think, listen, it's pretty obvious. I'm a learner. I like learning. And we always use the mantra in vet medicine about lifetime learning, and definitely continue to learn. I think be creative, be outside the box, be open, and be curious. Like at the end of the day, be curious, like stay curious. Like, I don't know, I think that's what's driven me to everything that I've done is my curiosity, and be uncomfortable sometimes. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It is going to be uncomfortable, but that's okay. Sometimes the most rewarding things in life are the things that are also the most uncomfortable. First time you learn to ride a bike, you were probably afraid. I had a fear of heights. I tried to overcome that by climbing. And the first time I was climbing, I was afraid. And after a while, I was less afraid. But now I've got that thing that I did in my life that I'm just like, wow, I was so lucky. So yeah, I think we just need to be open. And I'm like getting old now as a veterinarian, and I think back, I'm like, oh, I used to be like this. This is how we used to practice, and we did it like that when I was a vet, young and whatever. That's okay. It's okay to reminisce about that, but it's also good to embrace the changes that we are going to see and to embrace the next generation. I'm one of the ones who feel, listen, the millennials are different than me. There's no question. They're different. They have a different way about the world that I see, but it's a positive way. They are going to be more resilient longer term, I think. I think that they are much more engaged in a lot of different ways. So just embrace the change and be okay with it, and be okay with a little uncomfortableness. And our veterinary nurses, like that's our unsung heroes of our profession. I feel like they there's no way we could even do half of what we do without them, and yet they are sort of almost the most under-recognized people in our profession. I think if I was to say anything to my colleagues and to anybody, is we need to solve that, and we need to raise the awareness of what these people do and the expertise that they have. I was literally just talking to a colleague, a veterinary nurse today, and I said the only thing that separates her and I, she chose tech school, I chose vet school. She is just as smart as I am. She's just as creative. She's just as brilliant. She just chose another path. We need to highlight the brilliance of these people and allow them not to hit a glass ceiling at some point. We need to bring them up higher in the profession. And I think the public will accept that. I mean, we have nurse practitioners, and there's that veterinary nurse practitioner thing that's thrown around. I mean, we go to nurse practitioners all the time as humans. Who has a problem with your nurse practitioner? They're wonderful, wonderful people. Why are we not using our veterinary nurses like that today? Because there's, people go back on regulation and, oh, we can't because of the regulations don't prevent you from being a great nurse and seeing a client and giving them advice, like the practical things. There's only a certain few things they can't do. So why are we not using them better? And, Banfield's a group that has started to, really elevate that. There's a lot of other groups that are really promoting it. The Veterinary Emergency Group is another amazing group who, the way they use their nurses is out of this world, and the way they elevate them. And, I think there's just so much positive thing happening in the profession. And that's another thing that kind of gets me down, is when everybody just harps on all the negative things associated with vet medicine and the burnout and And I'm like, yeah, there is a lot of the negative, but there's also an awful lot of positive going on. And, like I said at the beginning, the reason I got in and stayed in this profession is because of the people in the profession. I like the people who are attracted to this profession. They are good people generally.
I agree very much so. All right. So I have some rapid fire questions to end us. So the first one is, what is something on your bucket list?
Something on my bucket list. Boy, to finish I started a backcountry cross country motorcycle ride last summer, and I need to finish that. So I ended up in Calgary. I need to get to Vancouver. It's not a very big bucket list item.
I bet I can just imagine that would be really, really fun.
It was awesome.
All right. What is a simple moment that brings you joy?
I think, just for me, it's sunrise. I love being up before the sun comes up, and then watching it slowly turn from darkness to dawn and then to light. And, anywhere you do that, I think it's wonderful. And I can remember doing this sometimes I used to go to Tofino, which is off Vancouver Island, and I'd go out on my surfboard very early in the morning. It would still be dark, and you'd be on this black ocean, and it's black, and all I'd be thinking is, "There's a shark that's going to come and eat me," But just watching the sun come up over the ocean and the colors, yeah, that's the pleasure. Just watching the sun in the morning, and just knowing you've got another day ahead of you. That's so exciting.
Yeah. If you could create a law that everyone had to follow, what would your law be?
Yeah, I don't even really have to think about that one. In some ways, I just think that people need to be kinder, you know, kinder, more humble, more generous, less greedy. So be kind. I think if you ask me for one law, just be kind to each other.
Yes, that would be my law as well. All right. And lastly, what is something you are grateful for?
What I'm grateful for, it's friends, family. I mean, bar none. I am so grateful for the people that have been friends in my lives and my family. For sure, number one, friends and family.
This has been the Vet Life Reimagined podcast. Whether you are listening or watching on YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Please make sure you are subscribed to catch all these amazing people in our profession. Also, send this episode to someone you think who would appreciate it. Have a recommendation for someone who would be a good guest? Please reach out on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. There aren't that many Dr. Sprinkles. Until next time, Vet Lifers.